I suppose whatever the phenomenon that we are about to examine is precisely, we are on the side of the guilty, I think, rather than the innocent. Because if we're to ask questions about why the support for or interest in Ukraine has waned, so well, I'm not sure support has, but interest in Ukraine's battle against Russia has waned so markedly in the 4 years since it started, then the media will obviously be part of the answer to that question. If you think back to Brexit, right? Not in a critical way yet. Don't send me the messages complaining that I keep reminding you how stupid you were in 2016. But have we ever felt as unified as a country and as a continent as we did in the immediate aftermath of Putin's invasion of Ukraine? You think back to the consensus in Parliament. Nigel Farage, of course, wasn't in Parliament at the time, and he continues to consider Vladimir Putin to be the most admirable politician on the planet, to the point, I suppose, where his former crony, who was taking bribes from the Kremlin, or at least from a Kremlin stooge to spout Kremlin propaganda in the European Parliament, probably didn't realise that he was going against party policy at the time. But I mean, him exempted, everybody was pretty clear about the illegality and the unacceptability of what Putin did. The ludicrous argument that somehow it had been provoked or that NATO was to blame, although popularised by Donald Trump. I don't know whether Donald Trump is taking bribes from Kremlin stooges to spout propaganda lines from the Kremlin. I don't know whether any of the people who spout propaganda lines from the Kremlin, and unlike Nathan Gill, haven't been convicted of any crimes, are secretly in receipt of kickbacks or blackmail. I don't know. But apart from absolute idiots or traitors, the idea that the invasion of Ukraine was somehow provoked by NATO or by Ukrainians is palpably obscene, any more than the invasion of Poland by Adolf Hitler was provoked by Poles. So we know that. But what we don't have much recent experience of is consensus. The fact that everybody agreed with that, even Boris Johnson, in the spirit of stopped clocks since time immemorial, and of course, despite his well-documented partying with KGB spies or a KGB spy in his family, and slipping the net of his own security officers in order to go and spend an undocumented weekend in the company of said KGB spy. Even Boris Johnson managed to say and do all the right things with regard to Ukraine, although almost certainly by accident, given that everything he ever did was motivated entirely by self-interest. What will be best for me in this current scenario? I think backing Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Ukraine will be best for me, Boris Johnson, in this current scenario. But perhaps that's an unfair quibble. Let's look instead at the fact that everybody was on the same side. I can't remember. Is there anything else like that in the last 10 years where we were all on the same side? You sort of go back further and look at military interventions in the Middle East. You have extraordinary disagreement and dispute. Probably the people opposed to the Second Gulf War have been vindicated rather more by history than the people who were in favour of it. So apart from the various traitors and shysters who were talking about poking the Russian bear and either wittingly or unwittingly operating a propaganda arm for Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, we were all more or less in agreement on this. And then you had that extraordinary experience of welcoming refugees, something that is so entirely at odds with the current flavour of this country. And yes, I know that they were white and European refugees, but they were still refugees and therefore subject to all of the same criticisms that other refugees would be subjected to. They could have signed on for benefits. They were taking our jobs. They were doing all the things that refugees have been accused of doing since time immemorial. Go back to the 1930s, and it was Jews, Russian Jews in particular, that the Daily Mail was encouraging British people to despise and reject. But the Ukrainians didn't suffer from any of that. The Ukrainian refugee project, albeit that it was largely funded and footed by the public as opposed to the government, was a glorious success. We probably all know people who invited Ukrainian refugees into their home with largely positive results. So the country was more or less united in its outlook. The welcome mat was rolled out for refugees when you think that it was just 2 years before somebody was turned into a folk hero by Nigel Farage for suggesting that we should be burning refugees to death in their own beds. 2 years before that, we were rolling out the welcome mat for all of the Ukrainian refugees. And I can't remember anything that spoke of similar unity or consensus in recent memory. Which brings us to today. This is going to shock you, I think, unless you, for reasons that remain elusive, spend as much time following the news as I do. So, story number one from earlier in the week. Zelenskyy tells BBC Putin has started World War III and must be stopped. So, I like my 1930s parallels. If you're a historian, you're probably going to tell me why I need to get rid of them sharpish. What would the equivalent have been of that? I mean, the person in this country who was sounding the alarm bell most vociferously about Adolf Hitler was Winston Churchill, who I think we can all agree turned out to be on the right side of history on that question at least. I don't know what the British equivalent would be of a politician really banging the drum about the threat that Russia poses. But it's not just the leader of Ukraine that uses language like World War III, of course. Others do as well. Another story number two, General Sir Rowley Walker is the British Army chief. The head of the British Army has chosen the 4th anniversary of Moscow's illegal invasion of Ukraine to warn us that Russia was building bigger and more lethal armed forces to prepare for a wider war. Chief of the General Staff said he could see no evidence of the Kremlin scaling back its ambitions. So, listen, what do you know what the biggest story on the and I get this, it's not in any way a criticism of anybody, and I've forgotten what it was, but there's quite a trivial story. It's so much easier to excite us and intrigue us with trivia or with simplistic analysis of sometimes complicated situations than it is to actually get our heads around the really, really big stuff. That's answer number one to the question that we're heading towards. We struggle to get our heads around the really, really big stuff because it's so big. I probably cite that Leonardo DiCaprio film Don't Look Up too often, but it's such a perfect allegory, isn't it? It's such a beautiful, poetic allegory that the threat that is on our horizon is so acute and we're so baffled by what we can do to resist it that we will just behave as if it is not there. Most obviously with climate change, possibly, probably, definitely, I don't know, multiple choice. A, B or C, possibly, probably or definitely. Go on, tick a box. I don't know what would be in box 4 marked other, but possibly, probably, definitely Russia should be in the same category as well. A massive threat on our very horizon that we are completely ignoring, because that's story number two. So the Ukrainian leader using the phrase, going for the button, pressing the button, Putin has started World War III and must be stopped. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? You might possibly conclude. But the head of the British Army, warning that Russia is building bigger and more lethal armed forces to prepare for a wider war. And then the third story, well, actually there's 4. The third story you heard alluded to in Dominic's news bulletin a moment ago. This is a sanctions package against Russia 4 years after that full-scale invasion, largely as a consequence, if I've understood this story correctly, of an IT blunder that revealed an apparent smuggling ring that has moved at least $90 billion of Russian oil and is playing a central role in funding the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. And it wasn't MI6 that did this, it was the Financial Times, the doyen of British newspapers at the moment. I mean, knocking everybody else into a cocked hat. 48 seemingly independent companies identified by the FT working from different physical addresses that appear to be operating together to disguise the origin of Russian oil. And it failed, or rather it broke this story because they all share a single private email server. As a consequence of this investigation by the Financial Times, the government has announced, this is where I think I followed the story correctly, nearly 300 new sanctions against key suppliers of military equipment fueling war efforts and people colluding in this export of Russian oil. So that's story number 3. Complicated, but evidence of the scale of the problem. Story number 4 is the maddest one of all. This is where you need George Smiley or River Cartwright on the case, because Russian spies have turned properties across Western Europe into a network of Trojan horses designed to unleash coordinated sabotage campaigns, intelligence officials have warned today. This is the so-called hybrid war on the West, and it sees Russian units suspected of purchasing, wait for it, sensitive real estate close to military and civilian sites in at least a dozen European nations. The new head of MI6 used her first speech in charge to warn Britain is now operating in a space between peace and war. She said Russia is testing us in the grey zone with tactics that are just below the threshold of war. So, sit down or pull up a chair or, I mean, not if you're driving, but just pause with me for a moment to reflect upon those 3.5 stories. Story number 1, Zelenskyy says it's already World War III and he's got to be stopped. Story number 2, the head of the British Army says we're on a collision course with Russia and they are preparing for more or war, whatever you prefer. Story number 3, they are buying up properties in countries like ours in order to quite probably put in place capability to launch sabotage campaigns in a so-called hybrid war. How loud do those voices have to be to shake you or me away from whatever else we're doing this morning? What was I doing this morning? I was complaining that I'd forgotten to put honey in my overnight oats and wondering what I might be able to... Don't at me, don't text me on what I might be able to use as a substitute. I've gone with brown sugar. I'll report back later. What were you doing this morning? Worried getting the kids back to school after half term, wondering about A-levels if they're in that age zone, looking at the announcement that the government made about special educational needs yesterday and wondering how they're going to affect you. I don't know, possibly wondering how an unelected man can be describing himself as shadow Home Secretary while waltzing around the country with much of the UK media following him. I don't know what you were doing this morning. Busy, cleaning the car? I don't know what you were doing this morning. But the head of the army and the head of MI6 have joined the head of Ukraine in warning us that we are either embarked upon or upon the brink of World War III. I'll say that again. The head of the army, the head of MI6 and our ally in Ukraine have warned us that we are either embarked upon or on the brink of World War III, war with Russia. They have broken the glass, but in your house, the bell ain't ringing. And I'd like today to try to work out why. Why is the bell not... I mean, if I'd said to you 10 years ago what planets would have to align for us to panic, for us to embark upon a programme of collective national panic, for us to call upon governments to give armies whatever it is they think they need to resist this. One of the reasons why we can't help Ukraine as much as we might is because the attempts by the EU to do so are being sabotaged by Hungary, by the authoritarian regime in Hungary. No prizes for guessing which British political party is constantly cozying up to the authoritarian regime in Hungary. But on this occasion, I don't think the fraudsters, shysters and tracers that populate that outfit are responsible for the failure of these bells to ring. I think it's on us. And by that, I don't mean the media. The media can only do so much. The Daily Telegraph, and how often have I told you that the Daily Telegraph has become a sort of bottle of bin juice when it comes to their comment pages or when it comes to much of their domestic journalism. Their foreign journalism is absolutely exceptional on this front. It is to the Telegraph that you should turn this morning to read Adrian Blomfield reporting from Finland on the Kremlin operatives acquiring a network of sites designed to launch sabotage campaigns. It is to the splendidly monikered Memphis Barker, their senior foreign correspondent, that you should turn to read a rather optimistic analysis of why the Ukrainian front line is holding up and people on it hold a rather rosier view of their prospects. It is to the Financial Times that you must turn to find out about the extraordinary investigation into an email blunder that has exposed $90 billion worth of Russian oil being smuggled out of the country. And it is quite probably to countries like Finland and Estonia and Poland that you should turn at least an ear to work out why the bells there are ringing loud. Ringing extremely loud. But these three men have broken the glass in Britain and the alarm bells are not ringing. And I want you to tell me why. 0345 6060 973. The head of the army, the head of MI6 and the head of Ukraine, using words like collision course or World War III or similar to describe the situation in which this country finds itself. This country, not warning about the threat to allies, not warning about the threat to Europe, this country finds itself in a situation worthy of descriptions like collision course, head of the army, World War III, head of Ukraine, and sabotage campaign, hybrid war, threshold of war. There you go, that's the hat trick. Threshold of war, head of the MI6. Collision course, head of the army. World War III, head of Ukraine. Why are our bells not ringing more loudly?